cafeteria at Brookdale Elementary was one of those places that always smelled the same no matter the day. A mix of boiled vegetables, industrial cleaner, and something faintly sweet that no one could ever name. Fluorescent lights hummed above long metal tables, and the kind of stillness that only comes after the lunch rush settled into the room. Most children had already hurried back to class, leaving behind a few forgotten napkins and the echo of chatter that clung to the air. In that quiet hour, William Crowley pushed open the side door with the slow certainty of a father who thought he was doing something simple, something kind. He had come to surprise his little girl with a warm lunch from the small diner on Lawson Road, a place where the coffee always tasted slightly burnt, but the grilled cheese never disappointed. He remembered how Lila's face used to brighten at the smallest kindness, how she would laugh like something inside her was made of sunlight. Today he hoped to coax that spark back, even just a little. But before William could call her name, he saw something that made him stop cold. There, near the emergency exit, his 7-year-old daughter knelt on the floor. Her small hands shook as she reached for pieces of her lunch scattered across the tiles. A bruised apple rolled in a gentle circle beside her. A crushed sandwich lay open like a broken promise. The milk carton had burst, sending thin white lines across the gray floor like veins in cracked stone. Standing over her was Bryce Halford, a broad-shouldered boy nearly twice her age. He stared down at her with a smirk that didn't belong on a child's face. It was the kind of expression shaped by too many unchecked moments, the kind that hinted someone had been taught he could get away with anything. Bryce nudged the overturned pink tray with his shoe, almost lazily, as if this scene were simply a pastime. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believed cruelty made him powerful. Lila didn't answer. Her thin shoulders rose and fell with small, quiet breaths. She reached for another piece of her ruined lunch, her fingers trembling so much she could barely grasp it. It was the kind of trembling that had been practiced for months. A shaking born not from cold but from fear a child shouldn't know. 10 feet away, Mrs. Nora Kellen stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her expression was unreadable, her posture stiff. She watched everything, and yet she didn't move. Not a word, not a step. Just silence. A kind of silence that told William more about her than any explanation ever could. The sandwich slipped from William's hand. He didn't feel it leave his fingers. His chest tightened, his breath caught in a place between disbelief and something far heavier. For a heartbeat, he could not move. He simply stood there, staring, taking in the sight of his daughter kneeling as though she had done something wrong. Lila looked up then, her eyes not shining with relief, but dimmed by something that made William's stomach twist. Shame. A child's shame. The kind that makes a little girl look as though she is the one who failed. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a thread pulled too thin. "He keeps doing this." Those 4 words slipped into him like a blade. William wanted to shout. He wanted to reach for the boy, to demand answers from the teacher who stood like a stone pillar pretending not to see. Every part of him urged action, loud and swift. But when he saw the way Lila braced herself for his reaction, he understood something deeper. Anger would only frighten her more. So instead of roaring, William knelt beside his daughter. His knees met the cold tile as he gently took the crushed pieces of food from her hands. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured, keeping his voice steady even as his insides trembled. "I'm here now, and this is never going to happen again." He didn't yet know what that promise would require, how wide he would have to stretch it, how much of himself he would pour into keeping it. All he knew was that his daughter had knelt alone for far too long, and this moment, this cold cafeteria floor, was where everything began to change. The house was quiet that night in a way William Crowley had not felt before. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that comes after a long day, but the heavy stillness of a truth finally revealed. The truth sat on his shoulders like something with weight, something that refused to be ignored now that he had seen it. Upstairs, the soft glow of a small crescent moon nightlight lit Lila's room. She lay beneath her quilt, her hands folded on her stomach, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though the plaster above her might give her answers she couldn't find anywhere else. William sat at the edge of her bed, elbows on his knees, trying to find the right words. He wasn't a man who struggled with language. In his life, he had spoken loudly when needed, quietly when it mattered. But this moment felt different. This was his little girl, and nothing he said felt big enough or gentle enough to meet her where she was hurting. "How long, sweetheart?" he finally asked. There was a pause so long that William almost thought she wouldn't answer. Then her small voice, thin and shaky, floated into the dim room. "Since the first week," William's breath caught. He swallowed hard, feeling something sharp rise in his throat. 5 months. 5 months of his daughter walking into a school that chipped pieces off her spirit each day while he made breakfast, tied her shoes, and told her to be brave. 5 months of quiet suffering masked as shyness, as grief, as the lingering ache of losing her mother. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, unable to keep the break from his voice. Lila turned her head toward him, her eyes glistening but refusing to let tears fall. "Mom said you'd protect me," she murmured, "and I didn't want you to fight. I didn't want you to get in trouble. I didn't want to lose you too." Those words struck him deeper than anything Bryce Halford could have shouted or thrown. They hit the place that still mourned Helen, the place that tried every day to keep himself from breaking in front of Lila. His grief and hers had been tangled for months, 2 wounded hearts walking through each day trying not to burden each other. Gently, William pulled her into his arms. She melted into his chest like she had when she was 4 and storms scared her. He smoothed her hair back, kissing the crown of her head. "You're never losing me, Lila. Not ever. But I need you to tell me everything." And she did. What poured out was not the simple cruelty of schoolyard teasing. It was a careful, repeated humiliation. Bryce Halford had tripped her in the hall, knocked books from her arms, whispered names that clung to her mind like burrs. He had kicked her lunch tray more times than she could count. He had poured water on her seat once so she'd sit down in shame. But the worst part wasn't Bryce. It was the grown-ups. "I told Mrs. Kellen," Lila said softly. She said to ignore him. "And I told the counselor. She said sometimes boys just act like that. I told 2 teachers. They said to try staying away from him." William's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to breathe evenly so she wouldn't feel the storm inside him. Every door she knocked on had closed. Every adult she trusted had allowed the hurt to continue, and she had walked with that weight alone. As her breathing slowed, her eyelids finally drooped with exhaustion. William stayed beside her until sleep settled over her small body like a fragile blanket. Then he stepped into the hallway, closing her door gently behind him. He leaned against the wall. The truth pressed down on him until he felt it in his bones. This wasn't a playground problem. This was a system that had chosen silence. And if he wanted justice for his daughter, he would have to uncover the rot that let a 7-year-old suffer in plain sight. Tonight, the promise he made to Helen grew larger than he ever imagined. And for the first time, William Crowley understood that tomorrow would not be a quiet day. The next morning, sunlight crept slowly across the kitchen table, touching the edges of a forgotten cup of coffee that had long since cooled. William Crowley hadn't slept. He had spent most of the night walking from room to room, pausing often in the doorway of Lila's bedroom just to listen to her breathe. Each quiet rise and fall of her chest steadied him and broke him at the same time. He needed answers. Not whispers, not guesses, but the truth. After dropping Lila off at school, William returned home and sat at the small wooden desk Helen once used for writing grocery lists and notes of encouragement she'd tuck into Lila's backpack. He rested his hands on its surface, remembering her gentle voice telling him that protecting their daughter meant more than guarding her from harm. It meant knowing when danger was hiding behind polite smiles. With a slow breath, he reached for his phone. The first calls went to other parents he knew from morning drop-offs and school fundraisers. Parents who had seen the way Bryce Halford swaggered through hallways as though the rules bent around him. Some answered with hesitation at first, unsure whether they should speak, but when William told them what he had seen, The tone shifted. One father admitted his son had been shoved repeatedly near the lockers. A mother whispered that her daughter had stopped wanting to eat lunch at school but never said why. Another parent confessed she'd filed a complaint months ago, only to be told her child was overreacting. The stories came together like pieces of a puzzle William didn't want to see completed. Then he called teachers, the ones he'd shared polite conversations with during school events. Their voices grew quieter when he mentioned Bryce's name. One admitted she'd reported an incident but never heard anything back. Another said she had tried to step in once but was told by the administration that the matter was already being handled. A third hesitated before confessing that speaking out had cost a coworker her after-school program stipend. Patterns emerged, not of carelessness, but of caution. A kind of caution that came from knowing where power lived. Finally, William called an acquaintance he trusted, a teacher from another school who worked closely with the district. "Bryce Halford is trouble," she said, lowering her voice even though they weren't face to face. "Everyone knows it. But his father sits on the school board, and Thomas Halford, well, he has a way of making problems disappear." William's heart sank. The weight behind the words felt old, rooted. This wasn't just about one boy acting cruelly. It was about adults choosing to look away because doing otherwise meant risking their own comfort. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his jaw. Each conversation tightened the knot in his stomach. When Helen was dying, she made him promise to protect their little girl. He had taken those words into his bones, believing protection meant being present, being vigilant, being strong when Lila felt small. But he never imagined that keeping that promise would mean standing alone against a structure built to shield the child of a man with influence. The truth he uncovered was bitter. Lila hadn't just been unnoticed. She had been deliberately overlooked. When he ended the last call, the house felt unbearably still. He looked toward the framed photograph on the mantel, Helen holding Lila at 3 years old, both smiling into the Arizona sun. Helen's eyes seemed to meet his now with a quiet plea. Do right by her. William stood, feeling the resolve settle in him like a stone dropping to the bottom of a river. Whatever came next would demand more strength than he had ever used in his life. But he wasn't going to let another day go by where his daughter faced pain that adults refused to see. The system had chosen silence. He would not. By the time the afternoon sun slanted across the living room floor, William Crowley had made more phone calls in a single day than he had in months. He wasn't the sort of man who collected gossip or pried into other families' troubles. But today was different. Today, every word mattered. Every story he heard pulled another thread from the neat image the school presented to parents, revealing something far more troubling underneath. He sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on its worn surface. Helen had chosen this table years ago because she said the wood felt warm even on cold mornings. William traced the grain with his thumb now, wishing she were sitting across from him, offering that calm wisdom she carried like a steady flame. He unlocked his phone again, scrolling through contacts. There were still people he needed to reach. He called a father he had once talked to during a field day event. The man hesitated before explaining that his daughter had been cornered in the restroom by Bryce's friends. They had mocked her stutter until she cried. She had told a teacher, but the teacher said the issue lacked enough evidence to pursue. Another parent shared how her son had stopped wanting to ride the bus because Bryce often sat behind him, flicking the back of his neck with an elastic band. She had reported it twice. Both times, the school said they would handle it. Nothing changed. The stories kept coming, layered with the same quiet defeat. A mother whose boy was shoved into the mud during recess. A girl whose homework was stolen and torn. A child who transferred schools after months of subtle, relentless torment. But the detail that struck William hardest was the familiarity in the parents' voices. Not anger, not outrage, weariness. They had grown tired of trying. They had learned the same bitter lesson. No one listens when the Halford name is involved. When he ended the last call, William rubbed his forehead, trying to ease the weight gathering there. He knew pain. He had walked through grief so deep it nearly hollowed him out. But this was a different kind of ache. It was the ache of knowing that the people entrusted with children's safety had decided convenience mattered more than courage. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. June Whitaker, the elderly teacher who lived 2 houses down. She had once taught Lila the gentle art of growing marigolds in a paper cup. William hadn't planned to involve her, but she had a way of showing up when someone needed kindness. "I heard a little of what happened," she murmured as she stepped inside, her voice tender but trembling slightly. "These things don't start overnight, William. They grow in shadows, and shadows spread when folks are afraid to shine a light." She lowered herself into a chair, folding her hands in her lap. Then, after a long pause, she shared something he had not expected. "Years ago," she said, "a teacher tried to discipline Bryce for pushing another boy. 2 weeks later, she was moved to a smaller classroom with half the resources. No explanation, no recourse. She left the district by the end of the year." William felt his stomach sink. Things got quiet after that. Mrs. Whitaker continued softly. "Too quiet. Folks learned that pointing out trouble only brought trouble back onto them, so they stayed silent, and silence can be the cruelest thing of all." Her eyes were glossy, the weight of years resting behind them. "I wish I had done more," she whispered. Those words stayed with William long after she left. They echoed the voices of other adults he had spoken to, people who meant well but had been worn down by a system built to protect the Halford name at any cost. And now Lila had become another child, swallowed by that silence. Standing at the sink, William stared out the window toward the fading evening light. If Helen were here, he knew exactly what she'd say. Do something. Not tomorrow, not when it becomes convenient. Now. He dried his hands on a kitchen towel and straightened his shoulders. He finally understood that this wasn't just a problem to address. This was a battle he would have to fight, and he would not fight it alone. Night settled over the Crowley home like a thick blanket, quiet yet restless, carrying the kind of weight only a parent truly understands. After putting Lila to bed for the 2nd night in a row, William stood in the hallway, hands braced against the doorframe, letting the truth of everything he'd learned sink in. The school wasn't simply overwhelmed or inattentive. It had chosen its side, and that side was not his daughter's. He walked downstairs, each step creaking softly beneath his boots. The house still held Helen's spirit in the corners, in the gentle hum of the old refrigerator she insisted they keep, in the small vase of flowers. Lila refreshed every Sunday when she remembered. William paused by the mantel, where an envelope rested beneath a photo frame. Helen's handwriting marked the front. He still couldn't bring himself to open it. Not yet. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lila once traced shapes in spilled flour while Helen baked bread. He let his fingers curl around his phone. Tonight, it felt heavier than before, as though every call he was about to make would tip their world in a new direction. He dialed the first number. A father answered, tiredness thick in his voice. William asked gently about Bryce Halford's behavior toward the man's son. A slow exhale came through the line, followed by a confession that had been carried too long. His boy had endured teasing, shoving, cruel names whispered when adults looked away. He filed 2 reports. Both vanished. William thanked him, offering a reassurance he wasn't certain he could deliver yet. He dialed the next number, then the next. With each conversation, the pattern grew clearer. 12 complaints in 3 years, 12 moments when parents trusted the system to act, only to be told their children's pain didn't meet the criteria for intervention. Or worse, that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. One teacher admitted she had tried to speak up. Weeks later, she was reassigned, her classroom taken, her position reduced. Another parent said she stopped complaining because she feared retaliation against her daughter. Somewhere between the 5th and 10th call, something settled inside William. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even shock anymore. It was a quiet, unwavering certainty that if he walked into that school tomorrow demanding justice, they would bury him in polite words, empty apologies, and paperwork that led nowhere. He didn't just need to confront the problem. He needed to expose it. For a long moment, William stared at Helen's empty seat at the table. He imagined her there, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, offering that steady gaze that used to anchor him when life felt overwhelming. "You can't carry this alone," she would have said, and she would be right. He needed people who understood loyalty, people who believed in protecting the vulnerable, even when the world misunderstood them, people who had stood with him in darker days, when grief threatened to swallow him whole. He reached for his leather vest draped across the back of the chair. Its patches were faded but proud. The Texas chapter of the Iron Brotherhood motorcycle coalition, a family he had ridden with for 15 years, men and women with rough hands and soft hearts, people the world labeled as misfits but who had carried him through the worst season of his life. William slipped the vest on, feeling its familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Then he picked up his keys, offering one last glance toward the photo of Helen and Lila. "I'm keeping the promise," he whispered. He stepped into the cool night. The engine of his bike rumbled to life, steady and low. As he rode down the quiet road toward the old diner where the Brotherhood often gathered, he felt something shift within him. He wasn't riding toward trouble. He was riding toward truth, and he was no longer afraid. The Devil's Rest diner sat at the edge of town like an old friend who had seen too much but never turned anyone away. Its paint was chipped from decades of heat and dust, and the neon sign flickered with a tired rhythm, glowing just enough for drivers to find their way. To most folks, it looked like a place where trouble gathered. To William Crowley, it was the closest thing to a sanctuary he had known since Helen passed. The parking lot held a familiar lineup of motorcycles, their chrome catching the moonlight in soft glimmers. He could tell who had arrived by the shape of the bikes alone. There was Bear Donnelly's old cruiser with its dented rear fender, Marissa Patch Delgado's shorter frame painted sunrise orange, and Jonah Rivers's meticulously polished black machine that always looked as if he cleaned it after every mile. William stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, and a wave of warmth greeted him. The air smelled of strong coffee, fried onions, and stories that had lingered in these walls long enough to become part of their grain. At the back booth sat Patrick Bear Donnelly, broad-shouldered, silver-bearded, his eyes the kind of gentle that comes only from a man who has lost much and rebuilt himself slowly. Bear looked up the moment William approached. Something passed between them, a silent recognition that this wasn't a social visit. "You look like a man carrying too much," Bear said, sliding a mug of coffee across the table. William sat down. He didn't rush through the story. He spoke the way tired hearts speak, slow and deliberate. He told Bear everything. Lila on her knees in the cafeteria, the shaking hands, the teacher who stood still, the months of silence, the phone calls, the pattern of neglect, the Halford name echoing through every conversation like a locked door no one dared open. When he finished, Bear leaned back, hands steepled in front of him. The diner buzzed quietly around them, but at that table the world felt narrowed to just two men. One burden shared across the worn Formica surface. "You sure you want to bring us into this?" Bear asked, voice low. "Once we start something, we don't back down. Not even when the town pushes back." "I don't want to drag anyone into trouble," William said softly. "But I can't let them bury this. If I walk in there alone, they'll sweep it under another rug, and my girl will walk those halls still carrying what they ignored." Bear studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in that slow nod he gave only when he meant something with his whole heart, he said, "Tell me what you need." "I need people who won't be intimidated," William replied. "People who know what it means to protect those who can't protect themselves. I don't want fists. I don't want threats. I want truth. Witnesses. Eyes that won't look away." A quiet hum moved through Bear's chest, something like a sigh but heavier. "Then we'll do it the right way," he said. "No raised voices, no trouble. We show up, all of us, and we shine a light so bright they can't hide a thing." That evening, Bear called an emergency meeting. One by one, Members of the Brotherhood filled the diner until nearly every booth and counter stool held a familiar face. Men and women seasoned by life's bruises, the kind of people society misjudged at a glance, but who carried loyalty with the steadiness of stone. William stood before them, hands resting on the back of a chair. He told Lila's story again, not loudly, not with theatrics, but with the quiet strength of a father who had reached his limit. There were no interruptions, no shifting glances, only a deepening silence that felt like a wave gathering power. When he finished, Bear rose. "The vote," he said, "won't take long," and it didn't. Unanimous. The Brotherhood would stand with William and with Lila, not to intimidate the school, not to stir chaos, but to make sure that the truth could no longer be hidden behind closed doors and polished smiles. A different kind of storm was coming. A storm made of compassion, resolve, and a community that refused to fail a child again. Dawn came softly at first, brushing the horizon with a pale silver light, as though the morning itself wasn't quite sure it wanted to rise. The air held that cool stillness that lingers before the world remembers to wake up. But the quiet didn't last long. At precisely 6 o'clock, the low rumble of engines filled the old highway outside of town, rising like distant thunder rolling over open land. One by one, motorcycles appeared, their headlights cutting through the early mist. They gathered in an abandoned parking lot at the edge of Brookdale, a place where weeds pushed through cracked pavement and old signs faded under years of sun. But this morning, the lot looked transformed. Rows upon rows of bikes lined up with disciplined precision, their chrome glinting like small sparks in the growing light. The Brotherhood had arrived. William Crowley parked near the front, his breath catching at the sight of so many familiar faces, people who carried their own scars, their own stories of loss and rebuilding, yet stood here now for a little girl most of them had never met. It was the kind of quiet solidarity that didn't need speeches or applause. It simply existed, steady as bedrock. Bear Donnelly stood beside his bike, hands in the pockets of his worn leather vest, watching the group with a mixture of pride and solemn resolve. Beside him, Marissa Patch Delgado was adjusting her gloves after finishing an overnight shift at the clinic. Her scrubs peeked out beneath her vest, a small reminder that these riders were more than the stereotypes whispered about them. Jonah Rivers, once a pastor, stood a few feet away, with his head bowed in a silent prayer no one needed to hear to understand. These were people who had lived hard roads, but refused to let those roads harden their hearts. When the clock struck 6, Bear raised his hand. Engines ignited in unison. The ground vibrated with the deep, steady growl of 200 machines waking the morning. Birds scattered from treetops. Porch lights flickered on in nearby neighborhoods. Curtains shifted as sleepy faces peeked out, wondering what this procession meant. The riders pulled onto the highway in tight formation. They moved like a river of metal and leather, flowing through town with a quiet dignity that turned heads at every corner. Drivers paused at gas stations. Bakers stepped from their shops with flour still dusting their aprons. Elderly men sipping morning coffee on their porches set their mugs down, watching the sight unfold. Some looked nervous. Others looked curious. Many simply watched with a solemn respect, sensing that this was something more than a show of force. This was purpose. As they approached Brookdale Elementary, the rising sun caught the tops of the motorcycles, painting them in soft gold. But instead of swarming the school, the riders eased into the overflow lot across the street. Engines clicked to silence one by one, leaving only the crisp morning air and the faint rustle of wind through nearby trees. 200 riders dismounted and stood together, not forming a wall, not blocking entrances, but simply standing in calm, steady rows. Their presence alone spoke louder than any raised voice could have. Inside the school, lights flicked on. Staff peeked out windows with anxious eyes. A phone rang. Another was picked up. And outside, William Crowley stood in the front row, his hands resting at his sides, his heart steady for the first time in months. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to make sure the world finally saw what had been hidden for far too long. The Brotherhood didn't need fists. Their presence was enough. Inside Brookdale Elementary, the school day had barely begun when tension rippled through the halls. It wasn't loud or chaotic at first. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something unfamiliar settles over a place that usually hums with the predictable rhythm of children and morning routines. Principal Sandra Walsh stood at her office window, her hand hovering just above the blinds. She lifted them slowly and froze. The overflow lot across the street, normally home to a few scattered cars, was now filled with row upon row of motorcycles, and standing beside them were 200 riders, silent and unmoving, their leather vests catching the early light. Her breath tightened. She fumbled for her phone. Within minutes, 4 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing in bursts that bounced off the school's brick walls. Officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting near their belts, their eyes scanning a scene that looked more like the opening to a standoff than a simple school morning. But something about the riders' posture gave them pause. No one shouted. No one approached the building. No one held anything more threatening than the steady look of a person who refuses to step aside from the truth. The officers stood still a moment, trying to make sense of this quiet gathering. Sheriff Hank Bowden crossed the street, adjusting his hat, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. He approached the front row where Bear Donnelly stood with his hands visible, calm as ever. A man like Bear could look imposing at a glance, but up close, the grief etched behind his eyes softened the edges of every assumption. "Morning, Sheriff," Bear said gently, his voice steady as old oak. "Morning, Bear," the sheriff answered, scanning the crowd. "You planning to cause trouble?" "No, sir. We're planning to shine a light on the trouble that's already here." The sheriff studied him for several long seconds. He saw no clenched fists, no wild eyes, no signs of violence waiting to erupt. Instead, he saw a quiet determination shared among the group, a collective resolve that looked more like protection than rebellion. After a moment, he nodded once. "All right then. But you stay on this side of the road." "That's where we intend to be," Bear replied. News travels fast in a small town, but this morning it traveled faster than usual. Phones buzzed on kitchen counters, messages lit up screens, and soon the local news vans arrived, their antennas stretching into the sky like eager hands reaching for the story unfolding before them. Reporters stepped out, glancing from the school to the riders, uncertain where to begin. To see 200 bikers standing silently outside an elementary school made for a striking image, one that begged questions. William stood near the center of the group, feeling a swirl of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He certainly hadn't wanted cameras pointed in his direction. But as he watched the reporters unpack their equipment, he understood something important. His daughter's suffering had been ignored because it lived in the shadows. Now, the shadows were gone. Deborah King, the Brotherhood's media liaison and a former reporter herself, stepped forward with calm confidence. She greeted the journalists with the warmth of someone who understood their job well. Instead of delivering threats or slogans, she offered neatly organized folders. Inside were stories, documents, patterns, names, dates, a truth too long hidden behind school walls. The cameras rolled, microphones lifted, and for the first time, the narrative shifted. This wasn't about bikers gathering ominously outside a school. It was about a community finally paying attention. It was about adults refusing to let silence win. And as the wind brushed through the early morning air, William felt the promise he'd made to Helen move through him again. Stronger now, steadier now. Today, the world would see Lila. Today, the world would listen. While reporters gathered outside and the Brotherhood maintained their silent formation, the heart of the story began shifting inside the school itself. What had been fear only a day earlier now stirred into something softer, something cautiously hopeful. When William walked Lila toward the doors that morning, her small hand tucked inside his, she noticed the riders first, 200 of them standing quietly, not blocking her, not crowding her, just being there. A steady line of people who, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, came to show her she mattered. Her steps slowed, but she did not shrink this time. She stood a little taller, her chin lifted by the warmth she felt around her. When she reached the entrance, a woman with soft brown eyes stepped forward. Marissa Patch Delgado bent down so she was eye level with the child. "You must be Lila," she said with a gentle smile. "I'm Patch. I'm a nurse. And I want you to know something. You're safe today." Those words settled over the little girl like a warm shawl. Patch placed a small pin in her hand, shaped like a guardian angel. "Keep this close, sweetheart. And remember, none of us came here to scare you. We came because we believe in you." Lila nodded, her fingers curling around the pin with surprising strength. She pinned it to her sweater, right above her heart. That simple act changed the way she walked through the school doors. Inside, whispers began before she even reached her classroom. "Is that her? The one they're all here for? Why are there so many bikers?" Children spoke in hushed tones, their eyes wide with curiosity, confusion, and something else, a stirring of courage. By second period, as Lila sat quietly at her desk coloring the edges of a worksheet, 3 students approached her. They weren't bold or confident. They came with small steps and hesitant voices. "Is it true?" one of them asked. "They're here? For you?" Lila swallowed, lifting her gaze. "They're here for anyone who needs them. That's what my daddy said." The children looked at each other, and then something remarkable happened. One leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Bryce shoved me last week. I told a teacher. She said to try not to upset him." Another child nodded. "He broke my pencil and laughed. I didn't tell anyone. They wouldn't listen." And a third whispered, "He used to follow me during recess. I was scared." Each confession cracked open the silence that had settled over this school for too long. Lila listened, her small hands resting on the guardian angel pin. She knew fear. She recognized the tremor in their voices. By lunchtime, the quiet courage had grown. 6 more children found her. Some approached her in the hallway. Others slipped into the seat beside her cafeteria table. Every one of them carried a story wrapped in the same uneasy truth. Bryce didn't just pick on one child. He picked on many. And each one had learned the same painful lesson. No one would help them. But today felt different. Today, they saw adults outside who refused to look away. Today, they saw teachers glancing nervously out the windows. Today, the fear that had held their voices down began to loosen. Children are quick to sense when morning light looks brighter than usual. They know when the ground beneath them begins to feel safe. That afternoon, the whole school seemed to shift, just a little like the first crack in ice before a thaw. As Lila walked to her next class, her steps slowed when she passed the bulletin board near the main office. A girl she barely knew touched her sleeve gently. "I'm glad you're not alone anymore," she whispered. And Lila, who had spent 5 long months hiding her hurt so her father wouldn't worry, felt something warm rise inside her. For the first time in a long while, she believed things might change. That afternoon, the hallways of Brookdale Elementary felt strangely heavy, as if the building itself sensed that truth was finally knocking on its doors. The school board meeting wasn't scheduled for hours yet, but already, murmurs drifted through classrooms, gathering like small winds before a larger storm. Teachers spoke in low tones, students whispered into their sleeves, and administrators paced with the uneasy stiffness of people aware that the world outside was watching. By the time the meeting approached, cars crowded every inch of the small parking lot. Parents who once hesitated to voice concerns now walked with shoulders squared and jaws set. Teachers who had spent years trying to simply survive their workdays without crossing the wrong line found courage in quiet glances shared between them. And behind them, standing shoulder to shoulder, the Brotherhood formed a silent wall of support. Inside the boardroom, folding chairs were pulled from storage closets to accommodate the unusually large crowd. What was meant to seat 50 now held nearly 300 parents pressed against walls, students perched on laps, teachers leaning against door frames. Conversations died down when members of the school board filed into their seats along the long table in front, and there, near the center, sat Thomas Halford. His jaw was tight. His fingers tapped sharply against the polished wood. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't need to. He believed he understood the room, or perhaps he believed the room understood him. Influence had always been his shield. Tonight, he expected it to hold. The meeting began with formalities, attendance, agenda, procedural comments. But everyone in that room could feel what truly waited beneath the surface. Then the testimonies began. A mother stood first. Her voice trembled at the start. But when she described how her son had been shoved into lockers for months, how she had filed reports that vanished without trace, her trembling faded into something sharper, steadier. She spoke not with anger, but with the pain of a parent who had been dismissed too many times. Another parent followed, then another. Stories spilled forward like water breaking through a cracked dam. Reports filed and never acknowledged, phone calls unanswered, children returning home with bruises and excuses they rehearsed to hide their fear. A boy named Marcus stepped forward next, 12 years old, his glasses repaired with tape. He spoke softly into the microphone, describing how Bryce Halford had snapped those glasses in half right off his face, and how the counselor told him perhaps he was provoking the behavior. The room held its breath as he spoke, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't. His calm hurt more. 2 former teachers came next. Both had been invited by the Brotherhood's legal team. They described disciplinary actions reversed without explanation. They described pressure to adjust reports, to reconsider incidents involving children with highly connected parents. One of them admitted she left the district because she felt she could no longer protect her students. A hush followed their testimonies, not shock, not confusion, but recognition. People finally understood the pattern they had suspected for years. The truth was no longer scattered in whispers. It stood united in a single room. Then William Crowley rose. He didn't stride to the front. He didn't speak with fire. He simply stepped forward with the weariness of a father who had carried too much for too long. "My daughter spent 5 months picking herself off the floor," he said, his voice low, steady, and every adult she turned to looked away. He paused, letting the silence settle. "Some of you think these riders out there are here to intimidate you. They're not. They're here to show you what courage looks like. My little girl had none of this. She faced this alone. And that ends tonight." Every parent in the room felt those words in their bones. For the first time, Thomas Halford shifted uneasily. And for the first time, the whole room realized his influence no longer protected him. The words William Crowley spoke lingered in the air long after he stepped back from the podium. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen often in a crowded room. A silence that feels like it is waiting for truth to take its rightful place, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge what had been ignored for far too long. At the center of the board table, Thomas Halford shifted in his chair. He straightened his tie, tightened his jaw, and leaned toward the microphone with the confidence of a man too accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Crowley," he began, his voice smooth but brittle at the edges. "I understand you're upset, but bringing a—" He hesitated as though searching for a polite word. A motorcycle group to a school function is hardly the way to resolve concerns. "Had you followed the proper channels?" Bear Donnelly stood before Halford could finish. Bear's voice was deep but calm, the voice of a man who carried sorrow like a shadow he'd learned to live with. "Sir," he said, "we have documentation from 12 families who followed the channels, who filed the reports, who brought their concerns to this very board." The room stilled. Halford's fingers stopped tapping the table, and every single one of them, Bear continued, was dismissed, delayed, buried, or erased. A ripple moved through the crowd, not shock, not disbelief, but something solemn and heavy, like a truth finally settling into its rightful home. Halford cleared his throat. "I think you misunderstand." Deborah King stepped forward next, her binder held firmly in her hands. As a former journalist, She knew the power of facts delivered with quiet precision. She opened the binder to a page marked with a single red tab. "This report here," she said, "never made it to the district office. And this one, 3 months later, was logged in the system, then removed within 24 hours. This one," she tapped another page, "was sealed without explanation. And all of them involved children who were targeted repeatedly by your son." Halford's face tightened, the flush rising from his collar. "You have no right to access those records," he snapped. "No," Deborah answered softly. "But we have every right to speak with the parents who filed them, and they gave us copies." A murmur spread. People leaned closer, as though gathering around the embers of a fire built from many small flames, each one a moment of courage. Then the superintendent attempted to intervene, but his words faltered under the weight of what sat in that binder. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. It became painfully clear that too many people in positions of responsibility had trusted Halford's influence more than their own duty to children. A mother rose from her seat, her voice trembling but resolute. "My son came home with bruises," she said. "I begged this school to help him. I was told boys would be boys." Another mother added, "My daughter cried every night for months. No one even called me back." A father followed, speaking with the slow steadiness of someone who had carried guilt far too long. "I thought maybe I was overreacting, but now I realize you made us feel that way." Truth came from every corner of the room, not angry, but aching. Then a small hand rose from the second row. People turned as a child stood Marcus, the boy with the taped glasses. He walked to the microphone with careful steps, the room parting gently around him. He looked directly at the board, then at Halford. "You let him hurt us," he said quietly. "You let him." There was no accusation in his voice, only a sorrow too heavy for a child to bear. Something inside the room shifted, then something final. Halford's shoulders slumped, the facade cracking. He tried to speak, but the words never formed. The power he had relied on for years no longer held. Because tonight, the truth wasn't whispered in hallways. It stood in a crowded room, visible to all. Long after the testimonies ended, the boardroom remained unnervingly quiet, as if every person inside felt the tremble of a foundation finally cracking. The school board members whispered among themselves, shifting papers not because they needed to read anything, but because they didn't know where to rest their hands. Truth had a way of making even the most polished individuals look suddenly small. Outside, the evening light dimmed, turning the windows into faint mirrors. William Crowley could see his own reflection, tired eyes, shoulders heavy, but behind him stood parents, teachers, children, and the Brotherhood waiting in calm solidarity. It struck him how different this moment felt from the day before. Yesterday, he had felt alone. Tonight, he felt carried. Across the room, Deborah King stepped forward again, placing the binder of evidence on the center of the table. The sound of it landing was soft, but it seemed to echo nonetheless. "Everything in this binder," she said, her tone steady but gentle, "shows a pattern stretching back years. Files sealed without procedure, complaints erased, teachers disciplined for telling the truth, children discouraged from speaking." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each board member. This didn't happen by accident. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Agreement, anger, but mostly relief. Relief that someone finally named what so many had felt in their bones. The superintendent attempted a weak defense, some mix of bureaucratic phrasing and half-formed excuses, but every word wilted under the collected stories of parents and the unreadable calm of the Brotherhood standing behind them. Then Bear Donnelly spoke again, his deep voice filling the quiet with something unforgettable. "We're not here to bring shame," he said. "Shame doesn't fix anything. We're here so this never happens to another child again." The sincerity in his tone softened even the anxious shuffling of some board members. It reminded them that this wasn't about blame, it was about responsibility. As the board recessed into a closed-door discussion, the crowd spilled into the hallway. Children leaned against their parents' sides. Teachers traded glances of quiet understanding, and William stepped out into the cooler air of the entryway, needing a moment to breathe. He looked across the street at the motorcycles lined in perfect rows. Their chrome no longer seemed intimidating. Instead, they looked like lanterns guiding a community through a long, dark tunnel. The riders outside didn't waver. Some stood with arms crossed. Some sat on the curb, hands clasped. Others simply watched the school with a respect that felt almost reverent. Just then, Jonah Rivers, his old friend with the gentle preacher's voice, stepped beside William. "You know," Jonah said softly, "truth is a funny thing. Folks can bury it for a long time, but once it's spoken out loud, it grows legs, walks around, opens doors that were shut tight." William nodded, his eyes still on the riders. "I don't want revenge, Jonah. I just want Lila to feel safe again." "And she will," Jonah answered. "Tonight changed something in this town. People saw the truth with their own eyes, and once folks truly see something, they can't unsee it." Inside the boardroom, raised voices softened into murmurs, then into long pauses. The closed-door session stretched on, the weight of consequences growing heavier with every passing minute. Reporters waited quietly, cameras ready but respectful. By the time the board members returned, their expressions told a story before any words were spoken. Shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. The confident posture that had once shielded them now cracked at the edges. For years, truth had been whispered. Tonight, it stood tall, and now the people who ignored it would finally face it. The room braced itself. The real consequences were about to begin. When the school board members filed back into the room, a hush swept across the crowd, a hush that felt different from all the others that night. This one carried a sense of ending and beginning at the same time, like the final stillness before a long-awaited rain. The board chair cleared her throat. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't try to hide it. After reviewing the documents and testimonies presented today, she began, "The board has reached several decisions." No one in the room moved. Even the fluorescent lights seemed quieter. First, Mrs. Nora Kellen, the cafeteria supervisor, is relieved of her duties effective immediately. A ripple moved through the crowd, not cheering, but a solemn acknowledgement. Mrs. Kellen herself stood in the back, her shoulders drawn inward. Her eyes glistened, not in anger, but in something closer to regret. She looked down, wiping at the corner of her eye. It was clear she had expected this, perhaps even believed she deserved it. Second, Superintendent Richard Hollis has submitted his resignation. A few gasps rose, though many had predicted this. Hollis stared at his folded hands, unable to look anyone in the eye. News of sealed complaints and erased records had left him with nowhere to stand. Third, 3 members of the school board have chosen to step down, effective immediately, to allow for an external ethics review. The chair paused, the silence swallowing her words. And lastly, Bryce Halford is suspended indefinitely and will be required to attend counseling before any decision is made about his return. You could feel the shift, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from justice finally finding its place. In the corner of the room, Thomas Halford rose abruptly. His chair scraped the floor sharply. He opened his mouth as if to object, but no words came out. Influence had been his armor for years, a shield he believed impenetrable. Tonight, it looked thin, brittle, almost small. He walked out without a word. Parents exchanged glances, not triumphant ones, but relieved ones. Not because someone had fallen, but because the truth had finally stood up. Bear Donnelly stepped forward and thanked the board for taking responsibility. The simplicity in his voice filled the room with warmth. "This ain't about tearing folks down," he said gently. "This is about lifting our kids up. Every one of them deserves better from all of us." Those words settled softly over the group. Even those who felt defensive couldn't deny their truth. As families began to gather their things, children tugged at sleeves, teachers exchanged quiet hugs, and the Brotherhood remained steady, present, but never overbearing. They stood like an old oak tree in a storm, not bending, not shouting, simply being a shelter. When William Crowley stepped outside, the night air felt different. Lighter, almost warm, even though the breeze carried a hint of cold. The riders stood just as they had before, rows upon rows of them, but now their faces held something gentler. Resolve still lived there, but so did pride. Not pride in themselves, but pride in what the community had done together. Marissa Patch Delgado walked up beside him. "Looks like folks finally found their voices," she said. William nodded, exhaling slowly. For the first time in months, the breath didn't hurt on its way out. "Thank you," he said softly. "All of you?" Patch smiled, adjusting the angel pin still fastened to Lila's sweater. "We didn't do anything you wouldn't have done for any child out there." Nearby, Jonah Rivers stood with his hands tucked into his vest pockets, his face turned up toward the dimming sky. "Justice isn't loud," he murmured. "Sometimes it whispers." Tonight, it whispered enough for everyone to hear. And as William looked across the parking lot, watching families walk to their cars with a steadiness they hadn't felt in far too long, he knew something important had changed, not just for Lila, not just for him, but for the entire town. The truth, once buried, had finally found light. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at Brookdale Elementary began spreading far beyond the town's borders. What started as a quiet stand on a chilly morning soon found its way onto local news broadcasts, then regional channels, and eventually national headlines. Footage of 200 riders standing peacefully across from a small-town school struck a chord with people who had never heard of Brookdale or the Crowley family. Strangers from cities William had never visited wrote comments online about courage, about community, about what it meant to finally see adults step forward when it mattered. For once, the country seemed united in recognizing something simple yet rare, a group of ordinary people choosing to protect a child who could not protect herself. But as attention grew, something else happened. The pressure on the school district increased, not from anger, but from expectation. People wanted to see real change, and change, slowly but steadily, began taking root. 3 days after the meeting, the Brotherhood returned to Brookdale Elementary, not to protest, not to confront, but to give back. The sun was barely above the treetops when William pulled into the school lot, Lila sitting quietly beside him. She held the little angel pin in her hands, tracing its wings with her thumb. The parking lot looked different today, not filled with tension or fear, but with a sense of purpose. Parked near the entrance was a large signboard propped against a pickup truck. In simple lettering, it read, "For the children of Brookdale, with love and protection." The Iron Brotherhood. William stepped out, puzzled. Bear Donnelly waved him over, a warm grin tugging at the edges of his beard. "We figured the school could use some new life," Bear said as the rest of the riders gathered around. "So the chapters did a little fundraising, a little more than we expected, actually." He handed William an envelope. Inside was a check for $42,000. William stared at the number, overwhelmed. Bear chuckled softly. Every chapter pitched in. Some folks heard the story and mailed in donations. Turns out, people like helping when they know exactly who they're helping. That money went further than anyone expected. New cafeteria tables replaced the old dented ones. Brighter lighting was installed. The kitchen received upgrades that made meal preparation easier. And perhaps most meaningful of all, the school launched a program designed by child psychologists to teach empathy, conflict resolution, and how to identify and report bullying in safe ways. The Brotherhood didn't stop there. They established a volunteer rotation called Angel Watch. Every morning and afternoon, vetted members stood near the school entrances. Not intimidating, not interfering, just present, smiling, waving, and reminding each child who walked by that someone saw them, someone cared. Their presence became a gentle deterrent, one that made children feel protected and adults feel supported. For many students, the sight of familiar leather vests became as comforting as seeing a neighbor standing on their porch. Inside the school, the culture shifted. Teachers who once felt constrained by unspoken boundaries now stood taller, empowered to speak up without fear of repercussions. Students learned quickly that silence was no longer the safest option. Honesty was, and when they spoke, someone listened. Even the smallest changes felt significant. A softer tone in classrooms, notices on the bulletin board encouraging kindness. Staff meetings focused on solutions rather than excuses. Parents holding each other accountable with newfound unity. Each step forward became a stitch, repairing a fabric that had been torn for years. And through all of this, Lila Crowley moved gently back into the rhythm of childhood. She smiled more easily. She walked into school without shrinking. She talked with other children during lunch, no longer looking for the corners of the room as a place to hide. One afternoon, as William waited near the entrance, he watched his daughter chatting with a friend, her laughter light and unguarded. It echoed through the air like a small blessing. Something inside him loosened, a knot he didn't know he had been carrying for months. The town had changed. The school had changed. And in quiet ways, so had he. But the story wasn't finished yet. There was still one more chapter to tell. A full year passed, the kind of year that moves quietly but leaves its mark in gentle ways. The seasons shifted over Brookdale, painting the town in warm golds, soft greens, and winter grays. And as the months rolled forward, the school that once felt heavy with silence began to hum with a different kind of energy. An energy shaped by trust, by new beginnings, by lessons learned the hard way. Brookdale Elementary was no longer the place that had failed so many children. The change hadn't happened overnight, nor had it come from a single decision. It grew from countless small choices made by ordinary people, teachers who listened more carefully, parents who spoke more boldly, children who found the courage to raise their hands when something felt wrong. Even the hallways felt brighter. Not because of fresh paint, but because of a sense of safety settling into every corner. Bullying reports dropped dramatically, not from lack of speaking up, but because the culture had shifted. Problems were addressed quickly. Students knew their voices mattered. Staff knew their responsibility extended far beyond their job descriptions. And families began to trust the school again, a trust carefully rebuilt, day by day. Every month, on a Monday morning, William Crowley pulled into the familiar parking lot. He always wore his cleanest shirt and brought a bag of picture books he had collected from thrift stores and yard sales. No leather vest, no engine rumbling behind him, just a father keeping a promise. The children would light up when he arrived, whispering excitedly, "It's reading day. Mr. Crowley is here." He would sit cross-legged on the floor among small faces, opening a book and letting his voice fall into the soft cadence of a storyteller. Some children leaned in close. Others rested their heads on their arms. It was a simple ritual, but one that became a thread woven into the fabric of the school's healing. Jonah Rivers often joined him, bringing gentle humor that made the kids giggle. Bear Donnelly visited sometimes too, always careful to sit in the back where his large frame wouldn't intimidate anyone, though children often flocked to him afterward anyway, eager to feel the warmth behind his quiet presence. And what about Lila? She grew. Not just taller, not just older, but fuller in spirit. The heaviness that once dimmed her bright eyes eased little by little. She laughed with friends, played softball in the spring, and sometimes came home with grass stains on her knees, marks of a childhood reclaimed. Her guardian angel pin stayed on her dresser, nestled in a small wooden box William made for her. She wore it on days that felt important, days she wanted to carry a little extra courage. One autumn afternoon, a new boy arrived at Brookdale. He sat alone at lunch, shoulders hunched the way Lila's once had been. She noticed him immediately. She saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he picked at his sandwich rather than eating it. She approached him with a soft smile. "I'm Lila," she said gently. "Want to sit with us? It's a little scary when you're new here. You don't have to be by yourself." The boy hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, a small act of kindness began to shift the ground beneath his feet. William watched from afar as his daughter guided the boy to a table full of chatter and warmth. She had become what she once needed most. As for the Halford family, their story took a different road. After intensive counseling and a transfer to a quieter school, Bryce began to face the consequences he had been shielded from for years. One day, when he was 15, a letter arrived at the Crowley home, a simple envelope addressed in uneven handwriting. Inside was a short apology, not eloquent, not flawless, but honest. William read it quietly, then handed it to Lila. She nodded slowly. "People change," she whispered. "Sometimes they just need someone to make them stop first." Thomas Halford never returned to public office. He moved out of state, his departure quiet and unremarkable. The shadow he once cast over Brookdale faded in time. Life settled into something steady, something ordinary. But no one in town forgot the lessons carved into their memories. At the end of that first year, William and Lila sat together on their front porch swing. The sky stretched above them in soft colors, the same porch where Lila once asked if they were safe. She leaned against him, her head resting where she always seemed to fit perfectly. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think Mom saw all of this?" William looked up at the evening sky, the first stars flickering through. He took a long breath. "I think she saw every step we took, sweetheart, and I think she's proud." Lila smiled, small but sure. "Me too." The swing moved gently, back and forth, its rhythm slow and comforting. The world felt quieter now, not from emptiness, but from peace finally earned. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, William realized that promises don't end when they're kept. They continue forward, shaping new beginnings long after the hardest chapters have closed. This story began with silence. It ended with a community choosing to listen. And now, dear listener, if this story touched something in your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Who protected you when you were young? What moment taught you the importance of standing up for someone smaller, someone quieter, someone afraid? If no one stood up for you, tell me what you wish someone had done. And if you believe children deserve safety, dignity, and a world that pays attention, go ahead and like this story, share it, and subscribe for more. Because together, we can keep these stories alive. And together, we can make sure no child ever feels alone again.